Hello everybody and welcome back. Today I'm going to be returning to a series that I started a couple of weeks ago called the Fantasy Masterclass Series. And this is going to be a collection of videos in which I take a certain storytelling element, for example, in the first video it was character work, and talk about the authors that I feel do this particularly well. Today what I'm going to focus on is prose. And I know that prose, there's a lot of variability in terms of what people look for in prose, especially in fantasy, because fantasy is a genre that has so many other storytelling elements, so many other pieces of the story that mean a lot to people and that people look for. So there are things like magic systems, the intricate world building, and there are a lot of fantasy fans who really enjoy those elements and just view the prose as the skeleton or the structure upon which these other really cool elements are built. You have others who really enjoy prose and who are looking for that sense of lyricism, that romantic atmosphere that can really bring fantasy settings to life. And then of course you have people who fall in the middle. The authors that I have chosen to talk about today are five of my, not necessarily my favorite authors, five authors whose work I admire a lot, whose books I have really enjoyed, but above all, whose prose has definitely stood out for me. The way that they write, I think, just fits the stories that they have written so well. They all have different strengths. Their writing styles, their choices, the words they use are all very different, but I think they all have the highest degree of command over the words that they are writing on the page. So the first one that I would like to talk about is someone who I think everyone would expect to be on this list. Someone who has been praised for his use of language since the publication of his books a decade or so ago. And that is Patrick Rothfuss. So whether you are fans of the Kingkiller Chronicles or not, I think that most people can appreciate that Patrick Rothfuss really knows how to string together a sentence. What stands out in particular for me about Patrick Rothfuss's writing is the lyricism. I think that there is a beauty and a simplicity to Patrick Rothfuss's writing. There are other authors that I will talk about today whose style is much more dense. It takes a lot of work or a lot of effort to parse through their sentences and find the layers and the meaning that they have there. But I think that Patrick Rothfuss's prose is actually pretty accessible. I think that this is part of what has given him such universal acclaim and part of what made his books so popular upon their release is that they are undoubtedly well written, but there is an accessibility there too. People at any level of reading ability can pick up one of his books and find something to appreciate. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a complexity to his construction of sentences as well, because I think for his books in particular, there's a lot to be gained upon rereading. Going back and reading through the stories another time gives you insight into the character work, insight into the plot, and you can also discover a lot of that symbolism, a lot of that poetic language that he has threaded or integrated through his writing. But whether or not, like I said, whether or not Kingkiller Chronicle is for you, I think it's hard to argue against the fact that Patrick Rothfuss is a beautiful writer. I know he has cited The Last Unicorn as one of his favorite novels, and that kind of whimsical style, that melancholic style of beautiful writing that Peter Beagle has, I think you can see some of that reflected in Rothfuss's prose as well. I selected a couple of passages from The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear that I feel really epitomize this beautiful type of writing that he has, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of them. So one of the first ones is a quote that is taken from Bast, one of the characters who appears at the beginning of the novel when it is set in the present time. And what I really like about this passage in particular is that from reading it, and if you haven't read the Kingkiller Chronicles, when I read this, This should clue you into some things about the narrative. So this quote says, "I swear by all the salt in me, if you run counter to my desire, the remainder of your brief mortal span will be an orchestra of misery." So there's a lot in that small little paragraph that gives us insight not only to the person who is talking, but about the world building, the use of words, the use of the turns of phrase like brief mortal span gives us the feeling that we might be hearing from someone who is themselves not mortal, who may be ancient, who may hail from another time or another place. And I think Patrick Rothfuss does this really well, tailoring his language, making it more or less archaic, the choice of the words that he uses, words that evoke nature, that evoke violence or darkness in the appropriate places. I think that, again, a lot of thought goes into the choice of language that he is using, and that is evident when you read through his novels. The next author on this list is one of those authors who uses a very dense style. So a little bit of the opposite of Rothfuss's style, but on the same spectrum, I would say. So this is another author who I feel writes in very poetic language, who has a very strong command of those poetic elements like use of simile and metaphor, but his writing is much denser than Rothfuss's, no question. And that author is Mervyn Peake, who of course is the author of the Gormenghast trilogy, the first book of which is Titus Groan. This novel, or this trilogy, is really a work of fantasy that is built up around a setting. These take place in Castle Gormenghast, and the castle itself is almost a character in these novels. Mervyn Peake's prose brings this setting to life, unlike anything that I have ever read in fantasy before. This is, as I said, very dense. This is not a book that you can pick up and peruse through lightly. I think it takes a lot of thought. I think it takes a lot of time to read through the pages. I think for fans of intricate world building, for atmospheric writing, or that feeling of making the book come alive and seem like something that could have been plucked out of a real world, I think if you enjoy those things, that you would probably enjoy this trilogy. But for the casual fantasy reader, my husband, for example, he hated this book. I think he made it 2 chapters in. He was like, no, life is too short to read books like that. And I completely understand that approach. This is, as I said, a very dense work of fantasy. But Mervyn Peake's use of language is exquisite. He has such a command of poetic language that it just brings this book to life. I did pick out a couple of quotes that I really enjoyed from this as well. And I think that this one in particular demonstrates what I mean about his use of language bringing that setting to life for people. So this quote says, "This tower, patched unevenly with black ivy, arose like a mutilated finger from among the fists of knuckled masonry and pointed blasphemously at heaven. At night the owls made of it an echoing throat. By day it stood voiceless and cast its long shadow." So that gives you a really good sense of the atmosphere of this novel. This is not a happy, heroic fantasy tale. This is a gloomy, dark fantasy where we follow the lives of this ancient family who lives in Castle Gormenghast and feels almost trapped and stifled by the expectations of everyday life. And that this passage, I think, really shows us the bleak outlook of the people within this castle. I think that it really brings to life the setting that Mervyn Peake had laid out here. And this book, I could pull any number of quotes from Titus Groan because Mervyn Peake does this so well. If you are interested in writing fantasy, I think that this is a must-read book for sure. If you enjoy poetic language, and if you really want to see how immersive a setting can be, then you should definitely check out Titus Groan. And it's for those reasons that I think that Mervyn Peake belongs at the top of this list. So this next author is actually one of my favorite authors, and I love his work for a variety of reasons, but I truly think that he has one of the most distinctive voices and some of the most beautiful writing in all of fantasy. And that is Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman, I've talked about a lot on the channel, I feel is a very versatile writer. He writes fantasy for children in the form of picture books all the way up to the darkest stories for adults. I personally love his short stories. I think that this is where his use of language and imagination really gets a chance to shine. And I just really love his writing. Some of the particular strengths that I think Neil Gaiman has include that distinctive voice. I feel like you could pick up a book and read a passage and know from reading that passage that the book was written by Neil Gaiman. I think he has a way of expressing really deep and profound sentiments without being sentimental. He talks about things, emotions, experiences that are universal without ever treading into the realm of the cliche. And this is evident not only in his fantasy, but just in his nonfiction writing as well. His New Year's Eve salutations that he writes on his blog, he writes about the same ideas and the same wishes for the future and the year ahead as everyone else, but somehow he manages to make it sound profound. His writing is tongue-in-cheek, but it is really funny. I always smile and laugh when I'm reading his works, and I just really, really enjoy his writing. I think that he is one of the best by far. Again, I picked out a couple of quotes that I feel like really embody the strengths that he has. So these are from a couple of his short stories and just a couple of smaller quotes for him. But there is a line from Fragile Things, one of his short story collections, that says, "There are so many fragile things after all. People break so easily, and so do dreams and hearts." And to me, that is just a lovely turn of phrase. And this is an example of how I feel like his language, this next quote that I'm going to talk about, reflects very well the maturity and the age level of his characters. And this is about growing up. So it says, "Grown-ups don't look like grown-ups on the inside either. Outside, they're big and thoughtless, and they always know what they're doing. Inside, they look like they always have, like they did when they were your age. Truth is, there aren't any grown-ups, not one in the whole wide world." And this is peak Gaiman. This is him taking a universal experience, aging, feeling like you're not ready for what life hands you, feeling like you have not matured inside into the adult that you were hoping that you would be. You still have the same worries and the same fears, and you didn't grow up the way that you had expected to 15 or 20 or 25 years ago. But he presents it in a way that is so simple and so beautiful that it takes away all of what makes that idea a cliche. He takes a subject or an idea that has been explored in countless works of literary fiction and makes it so accessible and so beautiful. The fourth author that I would like to talk about today is someone who has a style that is a little more stark and says just as much by what she leaves out of her books and what she leaves out of her passages as she does by what she puts into her passages. And that is Ursula K. Le Guin. Again, I think that Ursula K. Le Guin is probably someone who would be universally acknowledged to belong on this list. A lot of fans and also a lot of fantasy writers, the modern fantasy writers that we all love and enjoy so much today, all talk about the debt that they owe to Ursula K. Le Guin for transforming fantasy, for exploring what fantasy could really do. I think that she holds a corner on that literary portion of the fantasy market, and her beautiful writing is part of what helps with this. Ursula K. Le Guin's writing is very different from what you would find in a lot of children's literature. It does not line up with a lot of the really accessible writing that we see in books that are written for kids now, but I do think that it is beautiful. I think that she has a great command of the written word. And like I said, a lot of the time, it's not only what she writes, but what she doesn't write. It's not only the words, but the spaces before and after the words, which is very closely related to a quote that I'm going to read to you. That is what makes her writing so special. I read The Wizard of Earthsea for the first time as an adult, and I really enjoyed it. It was a beautiful novel. I wish that I had had the chance to read it when I was younger to discover what fantasy had to offer. I think that it would have been nice to read her books both as a child and as an adult, because I think it's the kind of story that can mean different things to you at different parts of your life. And I think her writing is something that makes it a classic, something that has kept it alive for so long. Again, I did write down a couple of quotes that I feel really embody the strengths of her writing. And the one that I just recently mentioned was, "For a word to be spoken, there must be silence before and after." And another thing that I really admire about Ursula K. Le Guin is she can write a very simple sentence and imbue it with this deeper philosophical meaning. There's a lot to think about. The Earthsea books are quite short, but there's a lot of digging that can be done under the surface, and her writing definitely helps achieve that feat. Another really beautiful quote that epitomizes the themes that she uses in her books is one that says, "The world is in balance. To light a candle is to cast a shadow." So a lot of what happens in Earthsea is a lot of the discussion, especially in the first book, is about consequences and actions and motivation and what your decisions mean, not only for yourself, but for the people around you. And again, the very smallest sentence, what is being said by Ursula K. Le Guin, encapsulates this idea that is huge and far-reaching and all-encompassing. And sometimes her writing is just beautiful. And this was a particularly beautiful quote that I wrote down because I loved it so much. And this says, "In that moment, Get understood the singing of the bird and the language of the water falling in the basin of the fountain, and the shapes of the clouds, and the beginning and end of the wind that stirred the leaves. It seemed to him that he himself was a word spoken by the sunlight." And if that is not just the most peaceful quote, then I don't know. That is so mindful. It just is so soothing. It puts me at ease to just hear those words spoken. And I think that Ursula K. Le Guin's writing is so, so gorgeous. And if you have not read A Wizard of Earthsea, if you have thought that you might not like it because it is written for children, then I think you should go out and you should read it right away. The final author that I have put on this list is definitely the one that I feel speaks most to my personal preference, because this is a style of writing that some people really, really enjoy, but I think a lot of people have difficulty with. So the final author that I would like to talk about is Laini Taylor. So she writes a lot of young adult fiction, but Laini Taylor writes the kind of excessively flowery language that definitely borders on purple prose, meaning prose that sounds stilted and actually is diminished by its use of poetic forms instead of heightened. So it has kind of gone so far over the line that it's not really that good anymore. But for me, I think Laini Taylor's writing stays right on the positive edge of that line. It is highly stylized. She writes stories that are very emotionally charged, stories that pull you in, and I think that her prose really reflects that. For me, it works really well. I like that flowery style. I really enjoyed it. I thought that it added to the story rather than pulling away, and it never became over the top for me. But I would love to hear everybody else's opinions. If you have read Laini Taylor, is it too much for you? Does it fall on that side of overly poetic, overly stylized, or is it something that you enjoy? But again, just to give and this is one that definitely out of context, I can see how people find this excessively flowery. So this is a descriptor of the main character in the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy. And it says, she moved like a poem and smiled like a sphinx. And to me, I really like that. And I really like the character, the main character, Karou, of that trilogy. And I think that describes her quite well. She is this strange, whimsical kind of person who other humans find very difficult to relate to, very difficult to understand. And I think it fits her character in the story, but I can see how people would not like that overly stylized form of writing. I also really like this passage that says, happiness. It was the place where passion, with all its dazzle and drumbeat, met something softer, homecoming and safety and pure sunbeam comfort. And again, that is incredibly highly stylized. It is definitely not to everyone's taste, but I just really enjoy Laini Taylor's writing. I would love for her to write more books. Something about that style just clicks with me. And there are other books that I have read that have that overly stylized writing. This Is How You Lose the Time War, for example, that I read that last year, and I also really loved that. I think I need it in small doses. I couldn't read a bunch of books like this back to back to back, but having one every now and then, I really like it. It's really fun to read that flowery kind of language, to get swept up in the romance of it all. And for that reason, I think that Laini Taylor deserves her spot on this list. Obviously, there are thousands and thousands of fantasy books. We all have different tastes. We've all experienced different authors. There are authors like Guy Gavriel Kay, for example, who I have heard nothing but praise for their prose, but I have not personally read their works. So if there are authors who you feel just their writing is above and beyond what you would expect for the genre, it is what stands out about their work, then please let me know. I would love to discuss it. I love beautiful writing. It is something that is not a necessity in a book, but definitely elevates the book for me. So if you have any recommendations, any authors that you prefer for this reason, then please let me know, and I would love to hear all about it. Thank you, and I'll see you with another video soon. Bye.